Ecosystem building starts as a metaphor in botany and then moves to business and ends up in economic development. We're going to talk about how that phrase is shifting, changing, and what it means for the $2.5 trillion in state and local government spending that shapes local economies today on Builders Live. Hi, I'm Chris Wink. I'm the co-founder and CEO of TechNews, the news organization. Ecosystem building. It is a phrase that actually gets used in a lot of different contexts, but those who are around kind of startup or tech stuff, what is often grouped under economic development, it has an increasingly narrow context that some of us have been in the game for a while, have seen go from fringe issue to pretty mainstream one in economic development. We'll talk a bit about how that phrase has shifted and what's under the hood of tech-led, entrepreneurship-led, economic development, what some of these phrases mean. To do that, I have a Sherpa of sorts, a guide, a longtime organizer in economic development and building, Rob Williams of SourceLink. Rob, nice for being here.
Thanks, Chris.
Rob, I know you're from this work, but start me off with some basics. How do you get into ecosystem building, economic development? How do those phrases, what do they mean to you? Just give us some credentials check and walk us through how you navigated those terms over.
I am happy to do so, and thank you, Chris, for this opportunity to share some insights. First, a disclaimer. This is literally emerging right now in front of our eyes in a way that is incredible, and I'm sure we'll get into that in just a moment, but I am not the one that has any answers on this, and I am not the one that is going to be authoritatively being able to define.
Isn't the secret that all of us are, though? Isn't this how terms work, right? Like the honest answer is terms are going to evolve the way all of us use the terms. So this is how we get there. So in some sense, you are the authority like we all are the authority.
Right. So a little bit of background about me. I come from an entrepreneurial family. 4 people in my immediate family have either started or grown very successful companies. And so I've got that element as part of just baked into my DNA and my background. Additionally, my dad is a natural prairie botanist. And so when I was growing up, I learned all about the tallgrass prairie and the ways that the plants are more together and the way that it can shape the environment in just amazingly impactful ways, from cleaning the topsoil to allowing for all the emergence of amazing plants and animal species that don't happen in a monoculture type of environment. And so when I think about ecosystems, and this is a common debate around the dinner table, we'd have my botanist dad saying, you can't use the word ecosystem to define an economic model because it is a natural model. And my mom would say, no. There is so much we can learn from natural ecosystem development and apply it to economic development. And the more I'm thinking about it, the more things we try, the more amazing stuff we see happen organically and the emergence of really interesting things that are happening. And so I quite literally kind of grew up with this dichotomy of ecosystems, entrepreneurship, economic development. From my very start as an SBDC counselor, I got engaged with the International Economic Development Council almost 20 years ago. I also got engaged and involved with the University Economic Development Association. At that time, I also joined the International Business Innovation Association in VIA. And I've been a longtime member and contributor ever since, during both my tenure at the University of Northern Iowa, where I was doing a lot of that grassroots ecosystem building programming, both in the Cedar Valley region of Iowa, later across the state. Then when I was recruited to join SourceLink National and do this all across the country, we started spinning up and developing programs and networks from Seattle to San Juan, and developing and using the best principles from both ecosystem building and entrepreneurship-led economic development. And so I'm just so excited to talk about this for so many reasons, and to better give kind of where I think the field is headed and what are the differences and similarities between the two, because it's not something that I've seen any clarity on, and I want to see that conversation advanced.
We just made me do one. I'm fascinated. I didn't know your father was a botanist, that kind of comparison, because I do think it's something that you and I have talked about. I find myself being this annoying nudge in conversations that, like, ecosystem is a really great metaphor, but it's a metaphor.
Right.
And again, I misspoke at the top, but it shows up in botany is where the term gets coined. And then by the 90s, this book kind of introduces as a metaphor for business. And the point of the metaphor was you had big species and small species. And you might think only the apex predator is visible, but whether or not you realize that apex predator cannot survive without this underlayer of other overlapping species. And time again, the actual lesson from that is often, and this is where I see constantly people get this wrong, that the big institutions, they like to use that word, but they kind of they're like, well, we're the only ones who really matter. We're the apex predators. But I've also seen contexts where a lot of the little guys are like, well, we're the only cool ones, or we're the only with it ones, and the big institutions are dummies. And the lesson for everyone from the metaphor of ecosystem is whether you like it or not, you cannot survive without the layer of it all together. So that's why the metaphor is effective. Help us a little bit. Let's talk, Rob, how it kind of collides into economic development, which is in some sense somewhat random. There's lots of industries that are occasionally using that ecosystem metaphor, and lots of business settings and coalition building settings and NGO settings. People use the term ecosystem, but it's now really been run with in a way where there are people with job titles who are doing it. And so how does this bump into economic development? What's happening right now in these worlds of economic development and what ecosystem building means there?
Yeah. And we knew that we were going into this conversation. We're tackling a super massive thing, but I'll do my best to kind of share where I kind of
like to challenge you, Rob. I mean, you know, SourceLink is one of these longtime organizers of ecosystems. So why can't I challenge you? You know?
Yeah. So, and I even in advance of this conversation, my mind's been racing, but I submit that we are actually in the middle of a very important convergence of entrepreneurship-led economic development and this ecosystem building. You know, this ELED, often tracked through KPIs, jobs created, dollars raised, ecosystem building, invisible networks, soft and fuzzy, building trust, forging coalitions, systems thinking. But here's the truth, and I think this gets back to what you shared. There is no ELED strategy that's sustainable without a healthy ecosystem around it. And there's no ecosystem building initiatives that can work, that are sustainable without critical ELED style supports and funding tactics. That's where a lot of the traditional money goes. We want so much to kind of bifurcate and differentiate the two, but they are two sides of the very same coin. And frankly, because they do have some different lenses, approaches, results, methodologies, there's so much that we can learn when we look at one and think creatively about the other. And it is a little bit of a misnomer to say that ELED does not do grassroots organizing, ecosystem building.
Which I should say is, when you say ELD, entrepreneurship-led economic development is what you mean. Yep. Sorry, keep going.
Yeah. And I'm sorry, that is a mouthful, and I'm going to spew acronyms, so please.
Yeah, no, it's the right acronym, but I just wanted you to, keep going.
But, you know, I was going through, I recently earned my entrepreneurship EDP, designated professional from IEDC. And as part of that, you have to learn about the entirety of economic development as a field. And one of the manuals, which I just so happen to have right here, you can't see it, but it's neighborhood development strategies. And I was just going back through and advance this conversation and kind of looking at what I had dog-eared. And it's just amazing to me. Neighborhood planning seeks to engage a broad spectrum of people, motivating them to work together, providing a way to channel their individual efforts. Here are the types of organizations that you need to bring together as an effective neighborhood planning professional. Banks, business owners, chambers of commerce, county planners, convention directors. I mean, this is the stuff that ecosystem builders do day in and day out. One of my favorite things was about building consensus, and that it's not necessarily everybody agrees. You know, these are like really good concepts, and it's the work is very much grassroots ecosystem coalition building, but you just wouldn't know about it unless you picked up the neighborhood development manual to know that that's a critical part of what an economic developer actually does. So anyway, I can go a million different ways with that, but it's just something that has been very prescient. I've been thinking a lot about that.
And as you might expect, as you and I know well, and folks who will watch this and read the piece, I I came to, some of the Kaufman stuff. I went to one eShip summit. I came to some of the early startup champion stuff, but I was a little bit outside. We technically were a news org covering this. I would touch in. We identified with this work, but we were trying to run a news organization. So I didn't hold the candle like many, yourself very much included, who like really tried to run with crystallizing these best practices, which we technically try to reference all the time, what Andy Stoll's now doing with EBLN, what Victor led at Kaufman. Lots of people like stewarded this as an ethos, which we can maybe get into, that took on the metaphor of ecosystem building and kind of like then also made it a job title. We're seeing in economic development organizations. I'm seeing it in large corporates that have a kind of civic stewardship. I've seen it a couple times in small nonprofits. We did a little bit of reporting where we tried to pull some LinkedIn data and showed where that term is showing up in job titles. So ecosystem and metaphor shows up a lot of places, but this lane has really run with it. And like any successful community, this is not unique here. Arts communities, like everyone goes through this where a bunch of people form friendships, build a community, an identity, a practice. And then as it succeeds, a sign of success is it starts showing up a lot of other places. And you kind of, that group loses control in some sense because now it's somewhat bigger than that initial group. That is a sign of success, right? Like you actually, you can't quite keep it now. How a lot of people use the terms and it starts getting stretched and then there's a point of tension somewhere there of how much can we or should we control and where does it show up? So from your seat, because you sit in both worlds, like kind of more traditional place-based economic development, which emerges out of a Second World War. It's got lots of legacy. It ties to business and retention. There's a ton of the terms and degrees and certificates and programs and jobs and jargon. And then there's like a 15-year little like window of a community. How are they interacting, and like what's the tension, or better yet, what's the opportunity for these two sides to teach each other something, which I assume is the point that there are these two communities, a very big established economic development one and a kind of like pirate ship of great organizers in ecosystem building have things to teach each other. Is that a fair assessment, I suppose?
I think so. And maybe this will be controversial, maybe not. But
we love that.
Here's where I sit. I genuinely, in my heart of hearts, believe that the future of economic development is through entrepreneurs and innovation. And the labels that we use, the methodologies that we use, may take a lot of different flavors. But at the end of the day, every single one of our communities thrives when we put entrepreneurs and innovation kind of at the center and are mindful of how we're developing and advancing that. And so when I look at ecosystem building as a field, or I look at entrepreneurship-led economic development as a field or as a practice, it doesn't matter as much to me so much as we are all moving forward and placing innovation and entrepreneurship where it needs to be as the focus. Because I'll tell you, when I think about ELED and I think about BRNE, that works for 10% of the cities, right? Most of us live in rural parts or in mid-American cities that will never be running in consideration for an Amazon or for a Microsoft or for these big firms to come in. And the attraction game we all know is not working. And we can't just support only second stage firms. We know from Kaufman and others, it's documented that all new firm creation happens with young and new firms.
Yes.
And so when it comes to just thinking about the strategy and the practicality of it, and like I said, this may be controversial, but I don't see how we can thrive as developers without placing entrepreneurship and innovation and startups and creation at the center of what we do.
So let's. I live in a time with
sorry,
you.
I know this is we
no, Rob, this is great. I want to push back on that once, and then I want to like hit one last thing on our way out on this check-in. We my sense or memory or read from the past is in the 80s we kind of start this tech-led economic development, because like we see like the emergence of computing. It wasn't totally showing up with the productivity stats yet, but there was a sense that kind of computing, what we then later called the internet, was going to matter. And so there was like a group of people who said economic development has to change from just manufacturing, but we have to think about these kind of like knowledge economies starting to emerge here. We see a lot of state-backed economic development organizations gets their roots there. Shout out to Ben Franklin Technology Partners, which had a different name in Pennsylvania, but there's versions around that. TEDCO in Maryland shows up in the early 90s because of that. It's kind of a classic. All right, we need to address this part of our economy. It's going to move things in a way that we can't in manufacturing. And so entrepreneurship-led, even in the framing, mirrors that journey. Put thing in front of economic development, and it was first tech-led. Now we have entrepreneurship-led economic development. What from my read, and this is where Rob, you can push me. The moment we're in, and why the journalist in me says it's entirely justified, is we had this pandemic boom. So I think a lot of us were doing stuff around entrepreneurship in the 2010s. But when I sometimes sat with some of the off-the-record conversations with like big dogs in economic development, they're like, sure, small business, gotta say small business because I'll get in trouble politically. But they're like, it doesn't move anything really. But we had a boom. We have a boom still. Business and corporations are way up, including high-propensity businesses. A lot of them, as always, are non-employer firms. We have a lot of employer firms growing in our communities now. And as you said, it's showing up even in rural counties. So it feels like that's why now entrepreneurship-led economic development is showing up. All 50 U.S. states have some version of an entrepreneurship strategy. Practically all regions do. There's data backing now. This seems to be a moment. We're not sure what AI is going to do, but we think it could further distribute out small firm activity in regions. So is that part of what you mean by it's the moment now? Because we have the research that's grown in the 2010s that now shows new firms create all net new jobs, not small, not big, but new, which is the MIT research that Kaufman relied a lot on. Is that the moment we're in? Like, it's different now than it was 5 years ago because we have a credible entrepreneurship boom across the country. Is that fair? Is that really the moment we're in? Is that why you're saying it now? Because you've been at this a long time and you weren't saying it 5 years ago was the moment.
I think that's exactly the moment that we are in. And I think the pandemic showed us the fragility of some of our systems and the power of local entrepreneurship to build resiliency. Many of us, myself included, if I'm being frank, didn't realize how much, and I work in this space, how much our main streets really mattered. Until I saw time. I was living in Kansas City, and I had 3 of my favorite restaurants within a 3-block radius close. And knowing what in the way that I work, what that meant for the impact of the community, the impact of that business owner, it did. It shifted everything. And then for the federal government suddenly to dump a ton of money into entrepreneurs and small business owners in an unprecedented way, it showed us we could do something amazing. And so now, in our current moment, it's very messy right now, and I do fear about kind of how things will all shake out. But we've got a taste of it. We've seen what's possible, and we know what happens if we don't support it, because all of us were very sharply impacted by the pandemic in some way, shape, or form. So I think it is a different moment, and I think all of us are looking at this with a very different place than maybe we would have if not for the pandemic, if not for some of these other things that have happened the last 5-10 years. So I gotta let you go here in a sec. The other obvious thing when we talk about terminology, and you and I we've talked about this. You and I have both had lots of kind of off-record conversations with people. Ecosystem building is an excellent metaphor. I love it. I use the word ecosystem liberally because it's a metaphor that works. It tells a lesson. But we also know that whenever you have working with a metaphor, it can feel somewhat. It's a great in-group messaging. Yeah. If you get the term, it's really effective. Yeah. But almost by definition, if you have a great in-group term, it almost by definition means there's an out-group. And so when there's this moment, this ethos that I think ecosystem building teaches, that you need overlapping systems, you need many different sizes, you need new business, but you need this all of the lessons that so many people that you and I both know have put so much great, important work into. Yeah. When we're in this moment, we have an ethos of lessons that can get injected into a very big, very consequential, if
niche or kind of less known industry of economic development. We can kind of inject this spirit into what could be entrepreneurship-led economic development, ELED. You either have the ethos or you have this term ecosystem building. And they relate right now. The term ecosystem building comes with a lot of kind of like that concept, the ethos. What lasts? And I guess I have my hope, but is that term gonna last? Is the ethos gonna last? Can both last? Play this out for us 5, maybe I won't do that to you, but in a few years, what do all these terms, does the term last as long as the ethos? That's the question I'm trying to ask you.
I think it's a really good and insightful question. And I don't know for sure. Well, I know the one thing for sure is I don't know. But I hope and I believe, and I think we have seen that the ethos will out and it will last over the terms that we use to describe the work. The tactics, I think, will also last. And we may call it BRNE, and we may call it site visits. But what we mean, we're going and having 100 cups of coffee with our local entrepreneurs to understand what's going on. And so I hope that that it is what the ethos that it does. And I mean, we've seen that borne out. You're to your own point. We called it tech-led economic development. We called it BRNE. We called it small business and neighborhood development. And now we're calling it entrepreneurship-led economic development. So I think it has always evolved. And what the next iteration will be called, I don't know. But I see a lot more people talking about entrepreneurship, about innovation, and moving in kind of that direction. And moving into the direction of talking about the economic impact as a result of the work. And so I think that we will probably need to, especially right now, double down and focus on the hard economics of why, and to continue to communicate that as best as we can so that we can get through some of the stuff that we see right now. But I hope that the ethos is what will carry us.
Can't say it better than that. Rob Williams, one of the founders of SourceLink platform for ecosystem builders. Can I say that, Rob?
Yeah, of course.
Which is what I should say. Place-based economic development categories. We'll say for
Exactly.
ecosystem builders, one of the OGs. Rob, thank you so much for your work and your thoughts.
Thank you for the opportunity. Really appreciate it. I appreciate what you are doing and leading the conversation locally and nationally on this topic in particular. You're doing outstanding work. You and your team. Anyway, I can keep championing what you're doing. You have my full, wholehearted support, and I'm excited to see where we are in a year, even 2 years, and the impact that this continues to make.
I agree with that, Rob. Same to you, and thanks for those kind words. We'll see you next time. To everybody. Bye-bye.